Over the last 4 weeks, I have done everything that I can, both at formal meetings and informal meetings, trying to convince my colleagues that our current policy on Gaza is morally indefensible, that it's not in our interests, it's not in British interests, and that it will have consequences for us both internationally and here at home. But in the end, I felt the government's position wasn't moving, and therefore I had to, on a point of principle, resign.
In her resignation letter to the Prime Minister, the Baroness lambasted the government's stance on Gaza.
Our policy in relation to the Middle East peace process generally, but more recently our approach and language during the current crisis in Gaza, is morally indefensible.
Once a standard bearer in the Conservative Party's quest for voters from minorities, the former chairman has become a political headache. So why did the Prime Minister take such an uncritical attitude towards Israel over recent weeks, risking her fury and that of millions of voters?
David Cameron has in the past likened Gaza to a prison camp. When he was leader, the last time Israel was involved in this kind of intervention, he described it as disproportionate. For some reason, he's not willing to go that far anymore, and it might partly be because he listens a lot to the regimes in the region. Very interestingly, much less critical of Israel than European governments. Perhaps because, like Israel, they see Hamas, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, other extremist groups in the region as more of a threat.
Joining us from Edinburgh is Sir Mingus Campbell, the former leader of the Liberal Democrats. And here in the studio is Douglas Murray, the journalist and writer. Min Campbell, first of all, do you think Baroness Warsi was right to resign?
Well, if she felt as strongly as she expressed herself in the letter, I don't think there was any alternative open to her. Let me say I agree with her judgment that it's morally indefensible and against our interests, but I would go a little further than that and say that I think it's against the interests of Israel as well, because how can you build any kind of peace, either temporary or lasting, based upon the kind of film and the kind of scenes we have seen on our television screens? I mean, essentially what's happening in Gaza is that the infrastructure is being systematically taken apart.
If that is the feeling of the most senior Liberal Democrat to Nick Clegg, which it clearly is, well, he's not going to resign, but isn't it rather surprising that no senior Liberal Democrat feeling so strongly has taken the same road as Baroness Warsi?
Well, each of us must make our own individual judgments about these things. But no one can be in any doubt, I think, that, for example, people like myself or Paddy Ashdown have expressed ourselves as forcibly as we possibly could. If I can pick up on the point Mark Urban's piece raised, I'm in no doubt that what has happened is disproportionate. I'm in no doubt.
And we will come on to that, Min Campbell.
We will
definitely come on to that. Let me just bring in Douglas Murray now. Douglas, do you think that Baroness Warsi's resignation is harmful to David Cameron in all sorts of ways?
No, not at all. I mean, it's fairly well known that she's been a bit of a nuisance to him for some time. She's been running effectively an independent policy on a whole range of things, which are areas to do with social cohesion and to do with the anti-extremism agenda, which are very much parallel but different from those of the Prime Minister.
Are you saying they're destructive? They're different?
Oh, yes. And I mean, many people who've worked with her, many people from voices inside the Cabinet and others have been quoted saying, before today, how destructive those parallel policies of Sayeeda Warsi's were.
Is her voice one that has echoes within the wider country? It certainly has echoes in the divisions in Parliament. That's clear from what Min Campbell's saying just now. But does she must be, assuming that people take different opinions on all sorts of things, she must be reflecting a different opinion in the country.
It's possible. I mean, it's been said for a long time that it's been fairly well known that Sayeeda Warsi wanted to have a ministry of her own. She didn't get one. It was clear time after time she wasn't going to get one. Well, among other things, for some time, it's very interesting, she's been sort of trying to create herself as effectively the Minister for Muslims. And that has been a very noticeable and I think highly sectarian move on her part. But this move, this resignation at this point, and let's remember, as Israeli troops are withdrawing from the Gaza, the timing of this, to my mind, is very, very clear. It is a very cynical, personal move for future career prospects.
Well, Min Campbell...
Well, I think, if I must say so, that's rather a personal and cynical attack. Whatever
but there are divisions in the country.
Whatever the motives of Baroness Warsi, let me make clear, I think the real issue is the substance here. Yep. And whatever reason she gave to herself, if in fact she had been so offensive to David Cameron, then of course he had the opportunity to ask her to step down at his most recent reshuffle. But we must really stick to the substance here.
Well, the substance of this as well is, and you very well said it yourself, is there's different language being used here. Nick Clegg has talked about disproportionate. You have said what happened in that school last week, when the Israelis hit the UN school last week, was a violation of international law.
I believe that to be the case.
What would you do about it?
Well, the question is whether or not it can be referred to the International Criminal Court. But as Mark Urban pointed out, or in his piece, it was pointed out that because Palestine is not a member, hasn't signed up, then the possibility of that is made more difficult. And of course, if you want to do it independently, you have to achieve a resolution of the Security Council of the United Nations.
So the reality is nothing really will be done.
Which you'll be pretty certain the United States would oppose.
Just say so. I mean, Min Campbell accuses me of doing something wrong by attributing motives to Sayeeda Warsi. Min Campbell is just attributing motives to the state of Israel, to an entire country, to an entire military, in accusing it of crimes. I think that people have to be extremely careful. And people like Ming, in positions like Ming, and people in positions like Sayeeda Warsi, have to be extremely careful at times like this. There is undoubtedly, and Sayeeda Warsi speaks to some of this, a grassroots, and particularly for the Labour Party, but for other parties as well, a grassroots movement, particularly of young Muslims in this country, who feel very whipped up over these. Who feel very whipped up by this. And people like Min Campbell and Sayeeda Warsi have to be extremely careful before they start accusing the nation-state of Israel of committing war crimes. There are crimes going on, and they are being perpetrated by Hamas, which is a terrorist group, and it is very noticeable in this whole debate that we do not hear from the Liberal Democrat Party, or indeed from figures like Sayeeda Warsi, the condemnation of the terrorist group Hamas, which should come out of your mouth at the very beginning of every statement.
I will do that now, as I did indeed on the occasion when the Foreign Secretary made a statement in the House of Commons. It's wholly unacceptable that Hamas should use rockets in an indiscriminate way.
And do you think that Israel should be allowed to defend themselves from Hamas?
Please allow me to finish. This is not Alistair Darling against Alex Salmond. And I regard it as wholly unacceptable. But it is equally wholly unacceptable that a country like Israel, which has the most sophisticated defence capability at its disposal, should be taking action which has the effect of putting the lives of innocent women and children at risk, more than at risk.
Can I just turn one other point in Sayeeda Warsi's letter, talked about the consequences of what she sees as our policy in Gaza in terms of radicalisation here in the country, and she talks about that having consequences for years. Do you agree with that?
Well, remember, that's precisely the warning that was given to Tony Blair on the eve of the military action against Iraq. And it's also been publicly stated by the intelligence services in this country that they're much concerned about radicalisation.
It's purist
that being so, listen, I'm going to finish my point, even if Douglas Murray won't listen to it.
Very briefly, Min Campbell.
Well, I'm just saying this.
Let Min Campbell finish.
I'm just saying this, that radicalisation is something which presents the most clear and imminent danger to the security of this country. And anything which, well, do listen for heaven's sake. Anything which adds to that, anything which brings any encouragement to that radicalisation is wholly contrary to our interests and to the security of every one of our citizens.
Thank you both very much indeed.